I'm Laura Newman. I'm a government affairs lead for the World Economic Forum. And I wanted to talk today about making rules for the fourth industrial revolution. And I thought before we get too far into this, I'd answer one question. Why should we care? I imagine people watching this presentation as sort of a few different archetypes. One, I think you have the traditional move fast, break things tech bro who says, why should we care about the rules? Technology is its own set of rules, or rather lack thereof. And on the other side of the spectrum, you might have the government regulator who says, you know, why should we change what we've been doing? I mean, the way that rules are made has been the same for 100 years. Why do we need to change this? And I hope that over the course of the next 15, 20 minutes, I can change your perception about, how rules are made around technology and why this is important. And so before we jump into a few examples, a quick kind of sense check. What is the fourth industrial revolution? And going back to the first one, the first industrial revolution, of course, is the invention of mechanization. This is in the 1700s, followed by the creation of mass production in the 1800s, then the computer in the 1900s, and now the fourth industrial revolution in the 2000s, if you will, which is the connection of all of these systems and then the perpetuation into artificial intelligence and these systems cooperating to sort of create something that's greater than the sum of its parts. So that's where we are now. But I want to start by going back to 1865 to maybe put a more human face or a more familiar face on this, and back to the streets of London, of all places. So in 1865, this was if you refer to the previous slide, this is the middle of the second industrial revolution, which is where, these new inventions like cars had just started to be made at scale. And in many cities around the world, including New York and London, horses outnumbered people. There were so many horses who were employed to do everything from hauling goods to transporting people to, a variety of tasks. And all of a sudden, there was this threat of disruption from cars. And so in this case, the parliament in England there, they said, okay, we need to make some rules about these new cars. And of course, there's lots of pressure on one. I think there's a safety aspect, but there's also a huge economic question of, if we replace horses with cars, what will happen to all the horseshoe makers? What will happen to the stable boys? What will happen to all of the facilities around the city that cater to this, incredible population of horses? So all of these factors came into a series of laws starting in 1865 called the Locomotive Acts. And basically what these acts said in England was, you can have a car and you can drive the car, but the operation of every car requires at least two people, one person to professionally drive the car and a second person to walk in front of the car, waving a red flag at all times. So as you can imagine, this cuts down on sort of the maximum speed. And they also said, if you drive in a city, you can drive 2 miles an hour. And if you drive in the countryside, you can drive 4 miles an hour. Of course, even compared to your average horse, it's not very fast. And so it sort of cut down on the whole advantage of having this newfangled contraption. And so, of course, horses continued to reign supreme in the UK, and for 40 years, these laws took effect. And I should mention, too, that the UK is not unique in this regard. In the United States, in Pennsylvania, there was a law introduced that said, if you're driving a car and you ever encounter a horse, you have to not only stop your car, you have to disassemble the car, hide it behind any shrubs or trees that might be nearby until the horse passes. Then you can reassemble your car and continue on your journey. Fortunately, that law was vetoed by the government, despite passing the legislature unanimously. Anyways, so the point is, this law essentially set the automotive industry back in the United Kingdom for 40 years. Meanwhile, in Italy and in Germany, the internal combustion engine and car making at scale took off. And the sort of the short-sightedness in this case of these regulators set the entire industry back 40 years. And that's something that I think is one lens to think of. Maybe this is an industry that was regulated a little bit too harshly. And on the other side, I want to jump forward about 150 years to Shanghai in the summer of 2017, which is something which is a unique moment in time and a time that I was lucky enough to be in Shanghai, which is a city of about 25 million people. So, you kind of see the inevitable conclusion of all those cars that were being invented in Europe 150 years prior, which is, there's congestion in Shanghai. And so as a response, these companies like the company Mobike that's pictured here developed a shared bicycle system. And they said, oh, if we leave these bikes on street corners and we allow people to unlock them with their phones, you'll be able to just pick up a bike, and this will cut down on traffic and cut down on carbon emissions and sort of the promise of a new way to transport yourself through a city. And it worked incredibly well until a few other companies got this idea. And then a few more companies got this idea. And then ultimately, you had more bikes than could ever be used by every single person in every city in China, littering the streets of the country. And ultimately, these companies all went, many of them, I should say, went bankrupt. Uh, and in the face of a new technology and a new industry that it wasn't regulated at all, and by design by the Chinese government said, let's let 100 flowers bloom, and then see what innovations take place. And I think in this case, it's sort of an example of the opposite. There was no regulation, or maybe some regulation or some guidelines would have been helpful and could have prevented a tremendous amount of waste in this case. And so the question left to us is what to do. I mean, I think it's easy to paint the future as either we live in a sort of an authoritarian dictatorship where tech companies answer to the governments and the governments alone, or we live in a sort of a dystopian hellscape where robots are allowed to kill everyone and nothing you can do about it. And so I think hopefully what I can convince you of today is that there is a better way to find the middle ground between these two extremes. And I guess the answer is business working with government. And I think the first thing that comes to many people's heads, when you say that, is regulatory capture, or as this cartoon would suggest, um, governments being unduly influenced by business, or the smoke-filled room. And I want to sort of challenge that perception because I think, especially in this era of the internet, in this era of collaboration, it's a lot easier to put business and government in the same room and have it be transparent, especially when there's a community involved, and especially when these sessions are open to civil society and academia. And this is, to put a name on this idea, we talk a lot about agile governance. And it's a way of recognizing that technology, especially, we've come a long way from the car in the 1860s, but the pace of change in technology is increasing exponentially. And if government wants to keep up and create meaningful, helpful, and not restrictive guidelines for industry and technology to grow, they need a new way of doing that. And I think there are a few ideas I would like to mention here just over the next few minutes about how to do that. And this idea is sort of broadly called agile governance, and it's focused on the future. It's all about sort of providing a space to experiment and recognizing that industry does play a role in regulating these technologies, but government plays a role in controlling and sort of accentuating the benefit while mitigating the negatives. And so I'll jump into just a few of these ideas very quickly. And one is called outcome-focused regulation. I think for so long, governments have been really focused on regulating the means of technology. And I think this, especially as technology was slower moving, was possible in saying, look, you're allowed to make a wheel this diameter, you're allowed to, hold this much in reserves if you're a bank, for example. But as I think the means of creating these outcomes change so quickly, it becomes very difficult to do that. And rather, in some cases, it makes sense just to focus on the outcome. And to give you an example, is anyone doing this well? Let's go in the same year, 2017. It was an auspicious year in Kigali, in Rwanda. And this was a country that had very restrictive drone regulations, as did as do many countries in East Africa at the time, and many countries around the world, such that if you wanted to operate an unmanned aerial vehicle in Rwanda, you had to license in a very specific way the exact model of airplane or aircraft that would be used, and then you had to uh, every time that aircraft was updated or changed, you had to resubmit a new application, and then that would be reviewed. And this was a process that took quite a bit of time. So if you were rapidly iterating a drone prototype, for example, this could take you months or years, as opposed to a few weeks to move to the next version. Interesting case in Rwanda. Rwanda is a very mountainous country, and it's a place where the roads to get to a place to get somewhere aren't particularly good. And so, if you're operating a trauma center in Rwanda, say for the victims of car crashes, or even women giving birth, um, you're sort of faced with a tough logistical choice. Either you store enough blood of each individual blood type in each of the trauma centers distributed around the country, to treat any potential person who might need it, which is something that it ultimately involves a lot of blood being wasted because the blood is only good for so long, and as it takes a certain amount of time for the blood to be transferred to these centers, you end up with blood going bad before it's used. And so in 2017, a company called Zipline had this idea of, why don't we keep the blood in a central repository and deliver it on demand to these centers as it's needed. And this revolutionized the process of delivering blood to these centers. And as Zipline iterated its system for launching the drones, for navigating the drones, for landing the drones, for delivering these packages from the drones, um, the World Economic Forum and a few other institutions worked directly with the civilian aviation authority in Rwanda and the relevant governing bodies, and created a whole new way of thinking about how do you regulate drones. And they're called performance-based regulations. And that's part of this whole idea, which is to say, look, let's recognize where the risk is, and let's regulate to mitigate that risk, and not just to control for control's sake each individual step in this process. That ultimately allowed the creation of not just this one company Zipline, but the creation of a whole new industry of drone regulations in Rwanda. Um, and then ultimately, that was a framework that was exported, not just to the rest of or many other countries in East Africa, but all around Africa as a continent, and indeed many countries of the world. So that's a sort of an example of that type of agile regulation in place. For experimental regulation, the idea is saying, can we construct an experiment with how to potentially regulate this industry and just see how it goes? This is something that's worked incredibly well with mobile money, both within Pesa in Kenya, and then in other parts, even in China, for example. This is a place where I think government has worked very closely with players, and created a regulatory regime that works well for both of them, while allowing rapid adoption of this technology. Um, Self and co-regulation. Netflix is an example of this in the US. Said, there's not a lot of regulation for how we should operate our business, which, is at the time and is still a new business model of streaming video. Like, what should the rules be? So Netflix led a coalition of industry players to develop a set of standards for what should the rules be? How do we protect privacy? How do we operate our businesses? How do we set recommendations for different movies? Um, so I think these are all ways that governments and the businesses that they regulate can work together more collaboratively and more effectively to, I think, mitigate the cost of this sort of rapid expansion. So the forms approach, and this is sort of where my job comes in. I think we're really committed to this idea of governments that do this well. I think will be the governments, and then the countries that thrive as we look into the 21st century. And governments that do not, I think, run the risk of really being passed by, as in my example, not to pick on the United Kingdom, but as the United Kingdom was passed by a bit by their unwillingness or their inability to embrace automotive technology in a responsible way. So I think if you're a country, or even if you're a company in one of these countries, the question is, okay, well, how do we do this then? What's the rub? And so ultimately, our answer is we've opened these centers for the fourth industrial revolution in 15 countries around the world, and they're hosted by the governments of these countries. And the idea is to create a transparent place to convene stakeholders in a given industry. And you can see here, this is a group of policymakers and business leaders from the mobility sector discussing policy gaps that exist. And what we found is, since that density centers started to be created in 2017, so like I said, auspicious year. We found that when you bring the right people into a dialogue with each other, you can help co-design regulation that is better than what either side would have created on their own. And so I think you have government on one hand benefiting from hearing the concerns and hearing the interests of business, and then business on the other hand uh, gaining some clarity and eliminating some of the risk or some of the uncertainty for where they're headed with their products, or where they might be worried about competitors doing something that they might feel comfortable with, or aren't sure what the regulations will be. Ultimately, these are countries or centers that are in 15 countries around the world, and we have partners in a few other places. And I think that this is, in my mind, is an example of how both businesses and governments, but also civil society and academia, really need to work together as we look at all of the challenges facing society. And I think it's easy to look back at the past 3 years as incredibly tumultuous when you think about the way that data is used, the way that um, the way that permissions are set up for any of whether it's AI or the Internet of Things, or blockchain or cryptocurrencies. I think that it's been incredibly tumultuous, and the only way that it's going to get better is finding these mechanisms, like a few of which that I described here, um, that can really ease that process of having that collaboration and creating laws that are a little bit permissive on both sides. I want to finish, and I just love this map, and I thought, if this is a presentation for Portugal, there's got to be some way to work this in. This might be very familiar to people in Portugal, but I had not heard of this until a few years ago. This is the Cantino Planisphere, which, at the time that it was created in 1502, was the most complete map of the world ever. And of course, and it was created based on the exploration of Portuguese navigators, but was actually a copy that was stolen from Portugal by an Italian spy, and then spirited back to Italy. And this gave the Italians, I think, the whole new view onto the New World, and the routes into Africa and Asia, and so forth. I think what's so interesting here is that I think when countries work together and acknowledge, I think, what they don't know, and I think the blank space on this map, I think, is a testament to that there's so much that can be accomplished. And certainly in this case, this was Portugal showing the world both what it knew and then what it didn't know. And I think that at the Center for the Fourth Industrial Revolution, and hopefully all of us together can embrace that spirit together. So I'm incredibly grateful to have this opportunity to speak to you all, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference. Thanks very much.